Theories of First Language Acquisition, Part 2. We have tackled the first theory, which explains how children acquire their first languages, that is to say, behaviorism, and we have seen that it is based on the idea of habit formation, and that learning of a first language occurs in the form of a stimulus-response couples. The second major theory is nativism. We've seen that Skinner wrote verbal behavior in 1957, and this was followed by Noam Chomsky's criticism of the book. Noam Chomsky wrote a review of F.B. Skinner's verbal behavior. This was in 1959. In this review, Noam Chomsky criticized Skinner's behaviorist account of language learning. He opposed behaviorism. This represented the first step in the cognitive or nativist revolution. On the whole, nativists claim that language learning is too complex to be explained just in the light of the general learning principles. Language learning is a special kind of learning. Language learning is an innate capacity, or it is an inborn capacity. Human beings have inborn predispositions to learn the language. So in their view, language learning is restricted only to humans. We can say it is species specific. It is specific to the human species. The nativist view is based on the criticism of the behaviorist view. Nativists have a number of arguments against behaviorism. Let's examine these arguments. The first argument is the uniformity and ease of L1 learning. We mean by uniformity the sameness. When we examined the stages of first language acquisition, we have noticed that all children acquire language without effort and quickly in the span of a few years. Despite that children have different mother tongues, they acquire this mother tongue at equal rate, and they go through similar developmental stages. The first argument states that even if children receive non-identical quantity and quality of linguistic input from their environment, if we take all the children who learn all the languages in the world, their mother tongues, obviously they do not receive the same quantity of input, the same number of utterances. Also, they do not receive the same quality of input. That is to say, some utterances that they receive are correct, others are not correct. So this is what we mean by the word quality. In spite of these differences in the input, in terms of quantity and quality, all children learn language in the same way, and they go through the same stages. And they do this easily and without any effort. So if we return to the behaviorist principle that a stimulus leads to the same response, we notice that different stimuli lead to the same response. And this is why the behavioristic explanation is considered weak. The second argument is poverty of the stimulus. We are always trying to show that explaining language learning through a stimulus-response couples is somehow inadequate. The adult speech that young children hear is a deficient model. That is to say, when parents talk to their children, their speech is not always perfect. Sometimes it is filled with incomplete sentences. Sometimes it contains false starts. Sometimes it contains slips of the tongue. So this is the input that is received. This input is deficient. It is poor. But what happens when children receive this kind of input? Although the input is patchy and non-perfect, children are able to construct a highly complex grammar. The utterances that they produce are sometimes correct, and little by little they become very complex. This means that the output or the utterances of children are different from the input, and this refutes that learning is kind of imitation, just receiving and reproducing the same utterance. Children receive something, but they produce something different. Even if children receive a meager stimulus, a poor stimulus, which they receive from their environment, they acquire their L1 very rapidly. So if we assume that input, or what the child receives from the environment, alone is responsible for learning a language, how could the imperfections which are received turn into a sophisticated speech, correct speech? Here we are trying to judge whether the behaviorist model is either adequate or inadequate to explain some reality. Behaviorism holds that the same stimulus is reproduced by the learner or the child. The reality says that a child receives something poor and produces something perfect. This proves that the model itself, the behavioristic model, is inadequate. We go now to the third argument against behaviorism. We always build these arguments on the principles of behaviorism themselves. We have seen that behaviorism or learning in behaviorism depends heavily on the feedback or the reaction that is received by the organism after the response, after producing the response. Feedback is very important, especially positive feedback or positive reinforcement. It is very important. Without it, the behavior or the utterance which is learned will disappear. If it is not reinforced, it will disappear. But now let's see what happens with children and try to judge whether reinforcement and feedback is really important. Is only content. Even if the child produces one word, this would be accepted by the parent. When parents offer feedback or explicit language instruction to their children, the children are not aware of it. So feedback itself is not effective. The question that arises, how do children acquire language then? So the principles of behaviorism, especially the principle of reinforcement, proves to be inappropriate. The fourth argument is about creative construction, the process of learning through creative construction rather than imitation. This is a criticism of the principle of imitation. Do children learn by imitation? Let's examine some of the utterances that are often produced by children while acquiring their first language. If we follow the principle of imitation, if a child receives an utterance like "they arrived," he would automatically and mechanically and passively reproduce it saying "they arrived." the child is not able to produce something that he has not heard. This is what the behaviorists say. But in reality, children are found to produce some utterances that they have not heard before. An example is an utterance like, he goed to the store, or we saw mouses today. The form goed is never produced by an adult. In other words, the child is never exposed to this type of utterance, but he produces this utterance. So we can ask about the source of this utterance. It's not received from the environment. What is its source? The same thing holds concerning the word mouses. An adult never says mouses. They say mice. But the child, an English child, sometimes says mouses. This proves that the utterance mouses or good are the product of the child. They are not received from the environment. Here, the environmental input never includes such utterances. The children are believed to create their own utterances. And this process is called creative construction. They do not only imitate, but they create. Sometimes they produce this type of errors like mouses or goat because they regularize or they generalize rules. But sometimes they overgeneralize. This leads to the production of this error. This error proves that the child is active. He's not only receiving and imitating. The child is actively constructing his own language. He receives input. He extracts the rule from the input. This will be a kind of hypothesis or a temporary rule. This rule will be used to generate new utterances. Some of them are faulty because of overgeneralization. This will be tested against new input and then the rule will be reformulated. The whole process is called creative construction. When the child does this, he improves his competence or the set of rules that he has in mind. On the basis of these arguments, the nativists have in fact, they started to think that language learning or first language acquisition is not explicable in terms of the behavioristic principles, and they have put forward a different view. The nativists believe that language is a species-specific cognitive capacity. It is special to human beings, and it is the result of inborn predisposition. This is called the language acquisition device. So the language acquisition device mediates between the input and the output. Since the input is different from the output, there should be something in between. For this reason, the nativists postulated the existence of the language acquisition device or the LAD. The precise place and nature of the LAD is debatable. So the theorists disagree over where the LAD is exactly and what is the LAD exactly. For example, the neurologists have identified multiple areas of the brain responsible for the perception, comprehension, and production of language. But the LAD is hypothetically what enables children to process language and build up a suitable grammar quickly and with no specialized input to yield a totally different output. So you see here in the diagram what happens when a child learns a language. The child receives input from the environment. He receives many utterances from the adults. Then the child produces an output, utterances. Some of them resemble the utterances which are received, but many of them are new utterances. So the child is able to produce something that he has never heard before. We say that the input and the output are different. While the behaviorists say that the input and the output should be the same because the process is just imitation, the nativists say that since the input and the output are not the same, they postulated the existence of something in between. And this is what happens in the mind of the child. Here, when I say the mind, this means that they recognize the existence of the mind, which was discarded in the behavioristic paradigm. This explanation of first language acquisition has gained a wide acceptance in linguistics and even in psychology, but it has received some criticism afterwards. And by nature, any theory is usually criticized and it leads to the appearance of a new theory.